Hello and welcome back to Indus News. Now we begin this hour with our top story, and that's at the United Nations General Assembly, where Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan says the international community should ensure that Kashmiris get their right to self-determination. Khan said the Kashmir issue is a test case for the United Nations. The Prime Minister said India must lift the curfew in Kashmir and release all political leaders. He went on to say that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a follower of an extremist Hindu ideology which believes in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims. He said if a war between India and Pakistan starts, this will not stay limited to both these countries. He said the country has successfully dismantled all terrorist groups, but India could stage a false flag operation to blame Pakistan.
So when we came to power, we decided that we would dismantle what was left of these groups. And this decision was taken not just by us, but by all the political parties in Pakistan. Unfortunately, they didn't implement it. So we came to power, we decided to implement it, and we dismantled whatever was left of the groups. And I know that India keeps accusing us that there are these groups there. I would like the United Nations to send observers, see for themselves what we've done. No Pakistani government would have dared to do this because it would have created strife. But we decided that there would be no militant organizations in Pakistan. What do you think the impact will have on people of Kashmir? What do you think they will think? The way they have been boxed in their houses, treated like worse than animals, no rights. Thousands of all the political leadership has been arrested, taken out of Kashmir. Even those Kashmiri leaders who were pro-India have been taken out. 13,000 boys have been picked up and taken to God knows which destinations. So what do they think? What will the people of Kashmir do when they lift the curfew? They will be out in the streets. And what will these soldiers do? They will shoot them. They've already used pellet guns, blinded young boys.
Well, before Prime Minister Khan's impassioned speech at the UN General Assembly, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and a large number of people protested outside the UN headquarters against India's illegal annexation of occupied Kashmir. The protesters chanted slogans against Modi's government and called for an end to Indian atrocities in the occupied valley. Members of the Pakistani, Kashmiri and Sikh communities participated in the demonstration. Occupied Kashmir has been under India's curfew and communication blockade for 55 days now. Well, the US says it wants New Delhi to immediately lift restrictions in Indian-occupied Kashmir. The State Department's South Asia official Alice Wells asked India to release detained political leaders. Talking to reporters in Washington, she said America is concerned over the imprisonment of politicians and businessmen. Wells called on the Indian government to resume political dialogue with Kashmiri leaders. She said the world will benefit from reduced tensions between Pakistan and India. She said President Donald Trump is willing to mediate if asked by both countries. Well, as tensions continue to rise between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, Pakistan boycotted the opening statement of Indian External Affairs Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar at the SAARC meeting in New York earlier today. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Pakistan will not engage with the butchers of Kashmir unless India lifts its siege of occupied Kashmir. Meanwhile, Pakistan said it's ready to host the 19th summit of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation inside Islamabad. Qureshi said dates for the summit will be proposed soon. He said no member countries have objected to the summit's venue. Well, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, schools and colleges are forced to be shut down by the Indian Army for almost 2 months now. But Kashmiri students have resorted to using their own resources, setting up makeshift schools to give lessons to over 200 children. This report will tell you more.
With books in hand, poems on lips and fear in eyes, Little girls and boys are determined to continue their education. Conflict and fear has caused palpable impacts on civilian life in Kashmir, particularly for children. The closures and violence in the occupied valley has led to student uprisings and protests. The students see their education put at risk and being militarized.
Education of children is suffering right now. We will not let our future generations suffer. We will teach them as much as we can. Until the time the situation is bad here, we will teach them.
Other students are providing basic medical care as well, so people don't have to leave houses for fear of arrest. Rubina said her 15-year-old son was injured by pellets fired by security forces while he was returning home from Friday prayers.
I was scared. I kept him in my neighbor's home, who took care of him and are taking care of him. I kept him somewhere else because I was scared.
Indian authorities have arrested nearly 4,000 people since the revocation of Kashmir's special status.
The government of Afghanistan has deployed more than 100,000 troops to guard polling stations for Saturday's upcoming presidential elections. The Taliban said they will block all roads on polling day and attack all election activities. One of the 18 contesting candidates, Bulletin Hikmatyar, has also threatened violence if the government rigs elections. Former MP for Faryab, Bashir Ahmed Tayanj, says majority of the districts are not secure enough to hold elections. He ruled out polling in at least 20 districts across Maidan, Wardak, Ghazni, Faryab and Nuristan province. Well, as people get ready to go to the polls in Afghanistan on Saturday to elect the country's next president, they'll be able to choose between 6 candidates who have emerged on the mainstream political scene. This reflects the divisions in the electorate as a whole. More in this report.
According to Afghan Independent Electoral Commission, some 9.6 million registered voters across the country will be eligible to cast their votes. The election was originally scheduled for April, but has been frequently delayed by security, economic and political issues at home and abroad. The domestic security situation in the country has further deteriorated since the suspension of peace talks between the US and the Taliban.
The biggest problem for Afghanistan is safety. Every day, different people come to my shop and complain to me that it's not safe out there. If we don't have a safe environment, we have no business to do.
Many Afghans fear these elections won't do the country much good either. Merchants are disappointed about the slow development of urban infrastructure and business opportunities. People don't seem satisfied with President Ashraf Ghani's tenure and are pessimistic that a lot...
Take the threat very serious. Yes, we've seen a number of attacks already, particularly since the breakdown in negotiations when US President Trump canceled a meeting with Taliban leaders, and the Taliban have made very clear that negotiations with the United States is not reason enough to bring a halt, at least even temporarily, to their armed endeavors.
James, you're right. We have seen a lot of threats and attacks, but what are the chances of the Afghan government keeping the voters safe and persuading them to come out and cast their vote?
I think it's a very fragile situation, and turnout is going to be very important in terms of the legitimacy of the government in these elections. Problem, of course, is you're talking about elections in a country in which the government does not have total control over all of its territory, and therefore, by definition already, there is a question mark of how representative the government is.
Well, look, elections are coming up in Afghanistan, and clearly it's a volatile country under war. But what do you think the future will be of the current president, Ashraf Ghani?
I think there are various layers here. First of all, if they pull off the elections on Saturday reasonably well, then of course that will be seen as a success for the government, whoever heads it after that, and the Afghan government backers, particularly the United States, will project that as a success. The election in itself, really, what it matters will only depend on how the solution to the Afghan conflict is constructed. So up until now, we've really had a situation in which the United States was talking about the withdrawal of U.S. forces with the Taliban, and those negotiations focused primarily on two issues: a timetable for the U.S. withdrawal and Taliban commitments that they would not engage in transnational political violence. That's a problem for the government, because if by not including the government in these negotiations, obviously the United States is sending a signal, and that raises questions for the future of whoever is going to be president, whether that's Ashraf Ghani or someone else.
James Dorsey, thank you for joining us here on Indus News. Now, the United States has announced the deployment of 200 troops, 4 Sentinel radar systems and Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia. The Pentagon says the arrangement will bolster Riyadh's defense and their civilian infrastructure. In a statement, the U.S. military said it's putting additional capabilities on prepared-to-deploy orders. 2 more Patriot batteries and a missile defense system will be prepared to go in case of a crisis. The move comes in after the aftermath of the September 14th attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. Well, Saudi Arabia calls for international action against Iran after accusing it of the recent attacks on its Aramco oil facilities. In his speech at the UN General Assembly, Saudi Foreign Minister Ibrahim bin Abdul Aziz Al Asaf called the strike a real test of the international community's will. He said Iran has jeopardized world energy supplies as well as international peace and the global economy. Asaf said Tehran's sources of finance should be cut off until it renounces its ballistic missile program. The foreign minister said the kingdom has never promoted war but will defend its sovereignty. Meanwhile, at a press conference in New York, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran had nothing to do with the attacks. Well, in other news, Turkey says it will continue its trade with Iran despite the threat of US sanctions. Speaking in Ankara, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said it's impossible for his country to stop buying oil and gas from Tehran. Earlier, Erdogan warned against blaming Iran for the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. He said it will be inappropriate to put the entire burden on Tehran without sufficient evidence. And staying with Iran, and its President Hassan Rouhani says the US has offered to remove all sanctions on Tehran in exchange for resuming talks. But US President Donald Trump says he rejected Iran's precondition of lifting sanctions before a meeting. After returning from the US, Rouhani said the offer is not acceptable under the current US policy of maximum pressure. He said Iran is ready for talks, but not in an atmosphere of sanctions. Tensions between Iran and the US have spiked since Washington withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. Washington also reimposed economic sanctions on Iran, which were earlier withdrawn under the deal. In retaliation, Iran has scaled down compliance with the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world after this short break. Hello and welcome back. Now, the British flag Stena Impero oil tanker has left the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas and began its journey home. The vessel was detained by Iran's Revolutionary Guards in the Strait of Hormuz for alleged marine violations in July. Tracking data shows the Stena has set a new destination for Port Rashid in Dubai. Iranian authorities accused the tanker of failing to observe international maritime law at the time of its seizure. The Impero was held after Britain seized an Iranian tanker off the coast of Gibraltar. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says he's committed to a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, Abbas said he will not cede to an emboldened Israeli stance. The Palestinian leader called for the UN to be a mediator in peace talks between Palestine and Israel. He also said he will not accept sole US mediation and said recent developments, including the US decision to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel, have jeopardized a future two-state solution.
A week before the recent Israeli elections, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to arrogantly announce that should he prevail in the elections, he would annex and apply Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, Northern Dead Sea, and Israel's colonial settlements, despite the fact that all these areas are occupied Palestinian territory. We reject entirely and completely this plan.
Now from the UN to Africa, in Egypt, where nearly 2,000 protesters have been arrested as calls for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's resignation intensify. This week, thousands have taken part in demonstrations across the country in defiance of a protest ban. In a statement, prosecutors said security forces arrested some foreign nationals in Cairo, including a Palestinian and a Dutch national. The demonstrations were called by self-exiled businessman Muhammad Ali, who accuses President al-Sisi of corruption. Al-Sisi has dismissed all allegations. Now, as the Brexit saga continues, the European Union says Britain will be responsible if the talks for a Brexit deal fail. In an interview, EU Commissioner President Jean-Claude Juncker said the bloc is doing all it can to avoid a no deal. Juncker said he and Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier are working for an agreement and said it will be a disaster for both Britain and the EU if the UK leaves without a proper deal. But British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says his government is quietly confident that the UK can leave the European Union with a deal.
No, I must say that we will obey the law, but we're confident we can come out on October the 31st, and the best way to do that is to get a deal. And so that's why the Surrender Act is so damaging, because I won't hide it from you, it has had the effect with our European friends of making them think, maybe Parliament can block this thing, maybe they will be forced to extend. And
Japan has raised its threat level for both North China and Korea. An annual defense paper approved the cabinet today underscores the country's fear of being targeted by both neighbors. The paper points to North Korea's development of miniature ballistic warheads and the absence of any concrete steps on denuclearization. It said Pyongyang is now trying to increase missile ranges, accuracy and surprise attack capability. The defense report also noted China's threat is expanding into space from regional seas and says Tokyo must prioritize space security. Russia has detained 3 North Korean fishing vessels and 262 crew members. Border guards say the vessels were poaching in waters that Moscow considers its exclusive economic zone. Officials have delivered the vessels to the port of Nakhoda. Border guards seized 30,000 squid as well as illegal fishing equipment. Earlier this month, Russia detained 2 North Korean boats in its territorial waters in the Sea of Japan. Russia said one of the vessels were attacked in its patrol, injuring 2 border guards. Well, Rwanda has received 66 refugees who were held in Libyan detention centers. The country has agreed to receive 500 refugees under a deal with the United Nations last month. Some 5,000 people from Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia and Sudan are estimated to be in custody in Libya, and the UN has been looking for places to resettle them. But only a few countries have agreed to provide them proper asylum.
Even if we are a small country, but we have enough capacity, we cannot say that since the country is small, we cannot get more refugees. We have 149,000. We are getting more and more, no problem.
For the first time in Saudi Arabian history, the kingdom has opened its doors to foreign tourists as part of its economic and social reforms plan. The kingdom has announced visit visas for 49 countries in a push to diversify its oil-centric economy. Until now, foreigners travelling to Saudi Arabia were largely restricted to resident workers, business travellers or religious pilgrims. But tourism chief Ahmed Al-Khatib said visas will be available online for about $80 with no restrictions for unaccompanied women. Al-Khatib said investing in the kingdom's tourism sector is a great opportunity for foreign investors. But he clarified that access to the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina will be continued to be restricted. The Saudi official said headscarves will not be mandatory for women tourists, but he said a modest dress code will be mandatory, including at public beaches. The Pakistan Navy is conducting a maritime exercise called Ribat 2019 in the North Arabian Sea, and it's to review operational preparedness of its forces. In a statement, the Pakistani Navy said the exercise is aimed at validating tactical warfighting procedures. During the exercise, successful rehearsal of live missile firings were heard from surface and air platforms. The Pakistan Air Force is also participating in the maritime exercise. Pakistan Navy Chief Admiral Zafar Mahmood Abbasi witnessed the missile firing and expressed his satisfaction on the operational readiness of the forces. Tens of thousands of students have gathered across New Zealand for a second global school strike for climate action. The latest round of protests builds on last week's marches by millions of children around the world. The organisers of School Strike for Climate reported 170,000 people protested nationwide. Students delivered a petition to Parliament calling on the government to declare a climate emergency. The strike is planned to roll through Asia and Europe before culminating in a rally in Montreal, Canada. Teenage activist Greta Thunberg is scheduled to speak at the rally. Now, in other news, as the world makes headway in the battle against HIV, Morocco has also shown some progress. For people infected with the disease, there remains a heavy stigma. More in this report.
In Casablanca, a group therapy workshop offers HIV patients a rare opportunity to speak openly about their disease. The ALCS also organises follow-up therapeutic care and screening campaigns with funding from the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. But despite this, some groups remain vulnerable.
What allows us to decrease infection rates is largely due to our work with the most exposed populations. And we have a lot of apprehension about the sustainability of the financing of this work if the Global Fund were to quit Morocco.
In this conservative society, HIV patients seldom talk publicly about the virus. The shame of the disease is so entrenched, it even permeates the medical establishment.
Moroccan society is a society without any mercy, not necessarily with your family and friends, but the whole society. There are educated people and others who are not.
With funding declining globally and controversy surrounding the management of UN AIDS, ALCS fears financial cuts. Morocco's fate will be determined at a 3-yearly conference for the Global Fund in October.
Well, we'll be back with news from business and sports right after this short break. Welcome back. Now in business news, European markets have opened higher with optimism over the state of US-China trade relations. Despite this, gains remain capped by escalating political uncertainty in the US. The pan-European stock 600 rose in early trade. Britain's FTSE 100 led the upward momentum, hitting its highest since last month. Frankfurt's DAX 30 and Paris's CAC 40 have also soared. Meanwhile, gold prices remain steady. Investor focus is largely attuned to political developments in the United States. Well, it's 28 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but we'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. Bye-bye.